Okay. Can you see my slides okay?
We're all good.
Excellent. All right, so thank you. Without further ado, so we are going to be talking today about approaching and supporting youth and families in distress and thinking about in particular how to connect and partner with families. So this is not news to any of us, but I think it's important to reflect for a moment on the importance of partnering with families to really center our conversation today. So when we think about family engagement, we know on a broader level that family involvement with schools is incredibly important and linked with higher attendance rates and graduation rates among youth. We know that it's linked with improved self-esteem, better behavior overall in school, more positive attitudes and feelings of belonging related to school. We also know that teens who have parents more involved in their school teams and talking with educators also are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. And importantly, we also know that these benefits are consistent across children from different race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic backgrounds. So why is it especially important to partner with parents of youth with mental health challenges? When we're trying to support youth in distress, this comes into play in an incredible way. But we often hear from school teams, do we really need to reach out to family? They're hard to get in touch with. Can we just move this youth through the system? Let's just get them connected. And we understand that. And at the same time, yes, we do need to partner with parents and we do need them on board for connecting with mental health services. And so there are a number of reasons why this is the case, but in particular, right, we think about parents offering a really unique and valuable perspective of what youth are like outside of school. How is that student functioning at home or with their peers outside of school? We often see situations that I know you all have been involved in where behaviors are wildly different. Maybe they are very challenging within the school setting, but at home are minimal, or maybe the reverse is true. And it's important for us to understand that in terms of recognizing perhaps what the function of the behavior is or how we're going to support and address that student. We also want to think about the context for those behaviors. So parents are able to provide what's happening outside of school that might be influencing or explaining what's happening for this youth mental health and behavioral health challenges. Are parents going through a divorce? Is the family experiencing homelessness? Is there domestic violence in the home? Are there other stressors? Things that would really be important for us to understand in terms of not only how do we support the student, but also understanding why this might be happening. We also get context from parents around what are effective strategies that might work, and really important conversations around what's the family's cultural or individual beliefs around mental health and ways to support and address those challenges. From a biopsychosocial perspective, we also know that family and home life are incredibly important, and you are all well aware of this. But more specifically, when we think about mental health intervention, and how we support youth, we really need parent buy-in here, right? To be able to connect with services, not just from a practical perspective, thinking about consents, getting release of information, when we're doing those going through that referral process, but also because, most youth don't bring themselves to appointments. They need that support from parents to be invested to bring them and also invested to make change and support what might be happening outside of the home. Family intervention might be an important component. So even though we know that partnering is really important, we also often find that there are many barriers that come into play. And barriers on both the school side and the family side. And as I'm talking through this, I'd love for you all to just reflect for a moment on, what are one or two barriers that come up for you or your school teams when you're trying to partner with parents. You can just stick those in the chat, kind of the most common difficulties that you come up against. And while you're putting those in, a few things to add. From our perspective, we often see that logistical pieces can come into play on both the school and the family side, right? On the school side, you have many competing demands, scheduling within the day, trying to find time to reach out can be really difficult. From more of an attitudinal or knowledge perspective, being unsure about, is this even really necessary, right? Maybe I've tried to interact with this family many times and it's been challenging, so I'm kind of throwing up my arms. Maybe I don't know how best to engage. And then also thinking about personal factors, right? We're all spread very thin. We have our own potential mental health challenges or just trying to manage our own well-being. We're dealing with the stressors of being in the middle of a pandemic, many different factors at play in our own personal space. And I see a number of great thoughts popping into the chat. It looks like some ideas around, yes, school hours, availability of family work, having many different kids with mental health needs, families' beliefs about mental health and stigma, denial and defensiveness, parent support, stigma, time, all common challenges. Yep. And I think from that family perspective, logistical pieces as well for them, right? Their own work schedules. Maybe they've had to miss a lot of work to be able to come to appointments for their youth's mental health challenges. And so they can't miss any more work. Maybe there are transportation issues. Perhaps they've had their own negative interactions with school staff and don't feel connected to the school or have mistrust. And they might have their own personal issues as well, right? Dealing with mental health challenges themselves, perhaps, or just their own experiences in interacting with the school. And so when we think about how do we overcome some of these barriers, we know that the most important thing, the foundation, is relationship building, right? We need to build a connection and understanding with those parents. And that starts with empathy. But even though you all know that empathy is important, there are things that get in the way of that. There are traps that we get stuck in, right? So we have parents that might be really difficult to reach. We might find that we're reaching out and giving empathy and the parents are not reciprocating. Or we have negative interactions with parents ongoing in a way that makes us have a hard time feeling empathy for that parent. And then we also just have so many different competing demands that we might not have time or energy to be able to give that empathy or to think about it, right? I got to pick up the phone and I got to make this call. But how do we step back into empathy, and how do we center this in our interactions with parents? So taking a moment to think, well, why else might that parent be hard to reach, right? What else might be going on for that parent? Do they have a really inflexible work schedule where they can't call me back during the workday? Are there other financial strains or stressors? Are there family challenges going on? Are parents just avoiding these conversations because they're really hard? Avoidance is a normal reaction, right, to challenging situations. Do parents have their own mental health challenges that they're working on? Why else might parents have been confrontational in that initial conversation or conversations, right? Are they feeling defensive? Are they concerned about the future of their child and whether the supports will be in place? And lastly, reminding ourselves, if I focus on this, how might it save time or energy in the long run, right? So coming back to this again and again. So we know that you are seasoned school professionals and know the ins and outs of important communication, but we wanted to also share with you some basic and important best practice tips that you might share with your school teams. You could take this slide and the next slide and create a little script or a guide to share with your school teams to make sure that communication is strong and following some of our best practice tips. So one of the most important things is thinking about, can we have communication with parents early on before we're in full crisis mode? When we interact with parents, can we balance the positive and the negative feedback while also offering hope and really emphasizing collaboration? So for example, instead of saying something like, your child's behavior at school is unacceptable, which would be a common initial conversation that we might start with, thinking about, we really appreciate having your child in our class. And also, he needs more support right now to find his success. We can work with you to help make this happen, right? It feels really different to hear that. And we're balancing what we're seeing this positive piece with, we need to make a change and we're going to help you to get there. And that can be really hard in the moment to think of. So we often recommend doing a little bit of scripting beforehand, list out a couple other examples like this that you might share with your school team or have your school team create, so that in the moment they're ready to go. And it's a little bit easier to find that balance of the positive and negative. We know that two-way communication is really important. And so in particular, asking parents for their preferences around how to communicate and trying to honor that. Is virtual better than in person? Is email better than phone? Is it possible to have walk-in hours or early or late connection points? And then just continuing to persist and in a patient way, because we are all in the midst of a pandemic and struggling and just trying to get through, and parents are doing the best they can. A few more best practice tips that we would love for you to be able to share with your school teams when we're talking with families about really challenging topics, behavioral health issues. Starting with the positive, as we were talking about, what is the family doing well? What are their strengths? Thank you so much for showing up here today, even though you are so busy and so strained. Wow, we know that the student has been getting to school each day, even though it's so challenging right now. Pausing often to ask for the parent's perspective, right? It's very important to make sure that communication is going both ways, avoiding jargon, staying solution focused, both for our own solutions and also thinking about parents. Really important to offer community resources, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. How do we help connect family and youth with their need? What are barriers that might come up with implementing the plan that we've come up with? And making sure that we follow up with the family with an email or a phone call to summarize what have we talked about and what are the next steps that we decided on. So even with our best intention, there can be a number of challenges that arise as we're communicating with parents. And so these are some of the ones that commonly we notice come up. So perhaps there are family stressors or mental health challenges that are going on for that family. So we want to think about, okay, what do parents need? How can we help support parents? Are there community resources that we can connect parents with? Is there something else that we're missing from a more financial perspective, resource strain, other types of outside support? Families sometimes have been hearing so much bad news that sometimes they really struggle, right? They don't want to talk with us again and hear another negative thing. So thinking about how can we have a maybe gentler approach, but more consistent approach? Does this family need, communication once a week, several times a month, maybe several times a week, but where we're balancing some of that positive with the challenges and the things that we need to continue to work on? Some families need more concrete assistance. And so that might be a situation where you say, I'm going to call with you. Let's set this up right now. Here's the number. Here's what to expect. Let's do this. Let's get it on your calendar. Other parents might tend to be more over communicating and really wanting a lot of frequent reassurance and interaction. And so those are times to think about, how do I set boundaries? Do we assign this family to one specific person so that family is not calling everyone within the broader school team? Or do we think about set firm boundaries in terms of how often we're going to respond to those emails or calls? And then on the flip side, for some families that might set a firm no when we're really trying hard to connect those youth with services, that's a time when we want to think about, how do we shift our focus, right? How do we use more motivational interviewing strategies to think about what are the family's goals and how can we help to get them there? There are times when at the end of the day, we might be limited and we may not be able to initially connect the youth with the services that we need. But that doesn't mean we necessarily give up. We just need to shift and kind of roll with that resistance and think about how to continue to move that youth and family in a direction of more support. We also know when we're thinking about working with families from diverse backgrounds, there are a number of important best practices that we'll touch on today. Of course, starting with an inclusive and welcoming space is very important, that youth, when they come in, they see representation of their backgrounds and their identities. But it goes really beyond that, right? So it goes to checking in on our own assumptions and our own biases. When we are picking up the phone to call a family and maybe we say to ourselves, I've called this family 10 times and they just don't care about their child's mental health, pausing to think about that could be the case, or more likely, what else could be the case? Why else might the family be not responding? And are there pieces related to that family's beliefs or their cultural beliefs around mental health or stigma that they may be experiencing that might be getting in the way of the conversation that we're trying to have or the supports we're trying to put in place? And thinking too about what are potential racist experiences that those families have had, or that their generations before the family has had with the healthcare system or the mental health system that might be influencing their trust in the system and interest in interacting with it. Thinking about caregiver primary language or preferred language may seem very obvious. It may seem obvious to not have children interpret for their parents, but we actually see this come up way more often than we want it to. So thinking about making sure that you have things in place so that you don't get to the place where there's quickly relying on children to interpret for their parents. This is a really challenging power differential for parents and children, can put them in a challenging place and also can lead to miscommunication. And then lastly, thinking about differences in communication style, right? So different cultures, some high context cultures are cultures in which we think about they rely on more indirect communication styles. So really relational cues, nonverbal cues, and body language, and more implicit and subtle in interaction. Whereas a low context culture focuses more on direct communication. So really emphasizing strong directive messaging rather than relying on body language. We're saying directly what we're hoping to have happen or what we think would be important to communicate. And when we think about high context cultures, so examples of this might be typically folks from Asian cultures, from Latin American countries, African American families, Arab families are examples of more typically high context cultures. Low context cultures tend to be Anglo-American or Anglo-European or European families. And there are many individual differences within these. So it's really important to talk to and ask families about their preferences. But overall, when we have a mismatch in terms of types of communication preferences and our own style of communication, we can often find that we are mismatched in terms of communication and understanding. So when we're reaching out and connecting with parents and youth in distress, it's really important to be able to offer resources and supports for that family. And I'm going to take a moment to just share one of the most important resources that we have here today, which we've built out as part of this UR-SOS project. So as many of you may know, there's a resource hub on our website. And as part of that, there is specifically a family resource page. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'm just going to share this website so we can take a look at it briefly together. So as a reminder, on our website, this is the resource hub page. We have a section here for families. And if we click on that, there are a number of really helpful resources that we can direct families to when we're talking about how to support youth mental health. So there are webinars on here about various topics that typically come up around